Today, we're going to be going over how to overcome limiting beliefs, insecurities, and fears with internal work, as well as a bit of emotional processing. A lot of the future episodes are going to be approaching problems using the tools that we'll cover today. So, this will be a really good foundation for how we can actually approach any situation healthily. Welcome to session 4 of Living Over Surviving. My name is Noah, and internal work is especially important because I was in a position where I had a pretty decent grasp of the philosophy and knowing what brought us happiness and how we can approach life. And one thing I noticed about the philosophy versus the internal work is that philosophy gives us that roadmap, right? It gives us that guide. So I think of it more like a map of life, but it doesn't necessarily fill in the blanks for how we can overcome and tackle anything we'll encounter on our journey. And that's really where the internal work shines through. Because knowing the happiness stuff isn't going to tell us how to overcome a poor sense of self, how to communicate more effectively with your partner or anyone in particular, and how we can overcome intrusive thoughts. It really doesn't prepare us for anything and give us the skills that we need to navigate things healthily. And even if you do have that direction, it doesn't actually mean that your life is going to be great. You just know where to look, which is really important, but it's not everything. So let's start with what internal work is. Internal work is when we get out of our heads and get more emotionally stable by reevaluating our perspectives and getting clarity on how to live. And so one of the things that happens when we try to work on ourselves is that we get bombarded with advice on primarily external things, right? So maybe it's get your money up, get your health down, or up, go to the gym, get a better job, start dressing better, start smelling better, whatever. But a lot of the work that actually needs to be done is neglected. And I'm referring to mainly things that cover our mental state and our emotions and our perspectives, because those really impact and tailor our lived experience, right? Everything is going to be viewed through the lens of our emotions, our mental state, and our perspectives. And if we neglect those, then we're kind of screwing ourselves, because going to the gym, isn't necessarily going to make you a happier person. It's not going to teach you communication skills. It's not going to fix your relationships by extension. And when we have the internal work and we have a lot of that perspective objectified, or rather we shift it to be more objective, as opposed to just dealing with our emotions and letting our judgment be clouded, we see things for what they are, right? Similar to how we approached happiness. We will change a lot of our priorities, because now we see that maybe levels 1 and 2, for example, like materialism, hedonism, and ego gratification, as in getting to one-up everyone around you, probably isn't the best, even though emotionally that's probably what we default to 9 times out of 10. But we can overcome that and then shift our focus towards higher levels of happiness, where we start to incorporate people in a healthier way and even include spirituality to really hone in on what's actually important to us. So as a result of internal work, we'll be able to approach things more effectively. It makes us more resilient, because then we get a better perspective that isn't clouded by emotion. And it's essentially the process that we have to go through when everyone tells us to get centered or to get over them, because that battle is very much internal, right? Like I said before, you're not going to suddenly get over someone or just come out of some tragic event because you essentially lifted rocks for a few hours a week. There's no real connection there. And sure, you could say physiologically, sure, with endorphins, it does make you feel okay, but that's very, very temporary. Similar to level 1, it's not actually going to fix your problems. And so we're going to cover mainly the mental and emotional side of working on yourself and how we can regulate and maintain ourselves so that we can handle getting hurt in any way. So when I say clarity on things and getting clarity in life in general, here are the things I'm talking about. So it's who you are, as in our own sense of self and what we believe to be true about ourselves. And this enables us to challenge our limiting beliefs. It gives us clarity on what's actually important to us, which gives us direction on where we want to go in life, how we perceive and approach things that happen to us, because then you have a better lens through which you're looking at your life and you're not defaulting to whatever intrusive thoughts that you're getting in the moment, right? Sort of like how in episode 0 we talked about if your partner isn't texting you back, the immediate assumption, if you are a bit of an anxious person, is to assume that they're cheating on you, which is clearly, or usually, not the case. It's just an immediate assumption that is rooted in emotion. Like our immediate reaction is, they're cheating on me. I'm not good enough for them. They never valued me. And then we might even be compelled to engage in pretty unhealthy behaviors because of that, right? Like if I think I'm not good enough, then I have to do more, right? Or I have to try and make them jealous to make it seem like I'm a hotter commodity than I actually am. But obviously, our own insecurity is getting in the way of that, and it really starts to breed unhealthy behaviors, which is never good in the first place. So instead of just being ourselves, we try and do things or change the value proposition, when really all we should be doing is being ourselves and communicating to get on the same page with them. We shouldn't have to convince them to do anything, right? We want someone who chooses us for us. And so when we start playing games like that, we're already cooked. Because the only way to get on the same page is by communicating your concerns. And we also talked a bit about that in episode 0. But essentially, a lot of the negative intrusive thoughts are really assumptions that only hurt us and our relationships. And they certainly, 99% of the time, aren't reflective of reality. The flip side to all those toxic behaviors is actually taking a step back and looking at the situation objectively. Because what we tend to do is we perceive an event, right? And then we assume whatever that event means. And so I perceive them not responding as they're cheating, or they don't value me, or I'm not enough, and that means I'm unlovable, right? Look at how we spiral, and that's something very, very easy to do, but it's only ever coming from within us. And these thoughts only ever hurt us the most, and since they're all rooted in emotion, because of our limiting beliefs, they're only going to hurt us and the relationship. The reality is that we don't really know what's happening on your partner's side of things, right? You don't know what they're doing or what they're thinking at any given moment. And if you're sure, then you're like a clairvoyant and you should be a trillionaire, because then you could take that gift and then take it to the stock market. And then you'd be a god. But if you feel unloved all the time, it doesn't mean you actually are, right? If they talk to you on a regular basis, they do so for a reason. If they are committed to you, they do so for a reason. Them having something that kept them busy just happened throughout our day-to-day. You know, maybe they're on their shift, or maybe they were tired after work and they're just taking a nap. So not texting back as soon as you want, we've really got to take a step back and think about if it's actually an indication that they don't value you. Right? Sure, in the moment we may feel that way, but is it really the case? Have they given any signs that they would do that to us, or that they don't actually value us? Like, are they dealing with anything on their end? Maybe they got something on their mind, right? We got to be a bit more understanding for the context of the situation. And one thing to consider in this example anyways, is why would we feel as if the stakes are so high and go from 0 to 100, right? Because we can look inwards and go, I feel, any particular way. Let's use the example of being unloved. I feel unloved when whatever happens. And if this is a common theme, and if this is a pattern with you, if you constantly feel unloved, or if the relationship is in jeopardy because they're not doing, X, then it's certainly something to tackle because, to me at least, it sounds like a poor sense of self if this is a recurring theme. Is this the thing that we default to? And then we could even bring into question if we trust them or not, right? And then we can even drill down further. Why or why not? Right? If I feel as if they are cheating on me and I know that it's probably not the case, why do I still feel as if that's a possibility? Right? It's certainly an area that you guys could cover. And you should be both on the same page with boundaries. And are you even able to have a difficult conversation? Do you feel as if it'll start a conflict if you bring those concerns up? And why do you think bringing up a concern is any kind of reason to end things? Or that they will end things if you bring up a concern? And if we really see that as the case, then it's worth asking yourself, do you really want to be with someone who neglects your concerns or who doesn't work with you and doesn't have a really solid approach to conflict resolution? In episode 0, we talked about that meaningful relationships with anyone require 4 things. 5 for romance in particular. Trust, loyalty, commitment, open communication, and the 5th for romance is exclusivity. We have to make sure our partner is on the same page in terms of how we approach these values. And if that's not the case and we're actually scared to bring up a particular concern with them, chances are there's something deeper in need of address. And this is the difference internal work makes, right? It forces us to get clear on things and to get out of our own heads, because then we become more inquisitive about what's actually happening in the world around us. And from that clarity comes stability, right? Especially when we learn to just chill out for a second and articulate what's bugging us, either for ourselves or to them, we benefit. And if you think that if I say something, oh, she'll think I'm a little bitch and leave me, we would then have the clarity of mind to be like, oh, maybe that's not a good idea. Maybe that she's not someone I want around if they're approaching conflict this way, if they're not hearing me out this way, if they don't take my concerns seriously. And we got to think to ourselves, someone who leaves us when we bring up an area of concern or be vulnerable with them, is this someone we actually want in our lives, right? This is a person who's supposed to be with us for life, who we're supposed to support each other, right? There's nothing cringe about being true to yourself and to others, and if they care about you, then they'll take you seriously, right? There are people who will say this kind of approach is beta behavior, or you're a pussy bitch for trying to get on the same page with your partner and getting vulnerable with them or bringing up a concern. But one thing to note is that imagine the kind of shitty relationship that they're in if they can't even communicate and articulate any of these concerns with them, right? They're the betas, because they can't even bring it within themselves or find it within themselves to be vulnerable with someone else, especially someone that should be able to handle it, right? You should absolutely ridicule them for their shitty position and their terrible approach to people. And so one thing we can change is actually our approach to people. Because once we have the chance to see things for what they are, and we can get stable enough to where we can grasp what's actually important, and we can know how to approach these things effectively and healthily, this is great because then we start to also treat ourselves better. This is when we don't want to tolerate the same shitty behavior out of fear of loneliness or out of poor self-esteem. And we think that they're the only ones willing to give us the time of day. The root cause of this, for example, is thinking we're unlovable. And that kind of makes us tolerate way more disrespect than we should, right? Internal work is all about seeing our own internal biases and challenging them, especially when they pertain to us. And we can even use this approach to combat generalizations. And this will just improve our own approach to people in general. In episode 0, we talked about generalizations, and the example I gave in terms of how we can actually overcome them is to apply them to ourselves. And so if you remember, I remember that we talked about applying it towards men. And we said, okay, well, all men want X, maybe it's senior citizens, or all guys are into feet, or all guys want to go to Mogadishu for for a vacation. All these really, really crazy claims. And when we see how they could be applied even towards us, it just falls apart with how silly it is. And this is essentially what the internal work amounts to, right? It's taking a step back, thinking about things, challenging our own preconceived notions about the world and ourselves, and then just living and trying to capture these new perspectives. If you have nagging feelings at the back of your mind, limiting beliefs about yourself, insecurities, this is essentially how we overcome them. Because then we start to understand what's going on. Maybe we even start to understand where they came from. And we start to see through all that garbage, and we see things for what they are. And we see that all those beliefs that we held about ourselves might not actually even apply. Because these are categories or labels that we put on ourselves from when we were small or didn't know any better, usually when we were younger. And we take those beliefs with us into our later years, and we just kind of assume them to be true. But we never had the opportunity to reflect or to really question them, and we just kind of ran with it. And this could be really, really debilitating, depending on what the belief is. I think of it as if it's a cage with really, really big spaces between the bars. And we just walked right in, but we never walked out, even though it's very, very easy for us to. These bars are the limiting beliefs. And it's very, very difficult because even though they are easy to overcome, we just have to do a little bit of introspection and reflection. We never actually do it because we just held them to be true and we didn't actually take a look to see the big space between the bars. So when we do start to reflect on these things, it does have crazy impacts on your self-esteem. And that's exactly what happened to me. You'll start to respect yourself a little more, right? You will start to treat yourself a little better. You won't tolerate disrespect. You won't be as stressed out because then you won't think that everything rides on you, or that if you make a mistake, then everything's going to go to shit. And of course, it will just confirm all the terrible things that you think about yourself. And this is commonly the case with people pleasers, for example. They think that they have to do all these different things and jump through all these hoops in order for people to like them or to put up with them, right? Chances are that kind of behavior is rooted in a very, very low self-esteem. And when we do that kind of introspection and we see things for what they are, a lot of the time we realize that we aren't as bad as we thought we were, right? And so we get more confident. So then that starts to manifest in your life. Maybe you start to apply for those jobs that you otherwise thought you would just get rejected from. Maybe you tell that friend how you feel about them. Maybe you ask that person out. Or maybe reach out to that person that walked out not on very good terms. Because then we start to think about what we actually want and how to go about things effectively. Because then you realize that all you can do is your best. All we could do is really give them the opportunity to make that change, right? So we present them the chance and they respond. It doesn't guarantee that they'll want to, but all you could do is present that opportunity, because that's the only thing really within our control. And even if things don't go the way you wanted, that's fine, because even if they're not willing to respond, that has probably nothing to do with us. Or, depending on what happened, it's just out of our control. If they aren't mature enough or emotionally developed enough to have that difficult conversation or to take us seriously, let's say we were the one in the wrong and we come to them to apologize and want to reach out and make things right, we can't really control their answer, but we could do everything in our power to make sure that they at least know that sentiment, right? And we did that with the reach out. If they don't care enough to give us a chance, it's not necessarily any reflection of us now, because we know that their perceptions of things may not necessarily reflect reality now, right? Now that we're in a healthier place. Or if they didn't care about us enough, then they're just not for us anyways, and we wouldn't want someone like that around anyway. There are some people who don't have the capacity to treat us properly. It doesn't really matter how this occurs. Maybe it's emotional underdevelopment, or maybe they just don't vibe with you. All we can do is our best, and if they're willing to work with us, then great. We could take it from there and see what the relationship would look like. Whether it be a friendship, romance, etc., whatever. But if not, then we don't really have to sweat it, because it's not the end of the world, right? Because then, even if this person doesn't necessarily vibe with us, we could always see other people who do. And once we get a better grasp of our own worth, and we get that clarity on how we should be treated, and how we can articulate things, and how we want to incorporate other people into our lives, keeping someone like that who isn't really responsive to our promptings or reach outs to try and deepen our emotional connection with them, that's kind of it, right? All we can do is our best, and we really need to make sure that we're cognizant of that, right? If a door closes, it's not a reflection of us. We don't have to ruminate on what that says about us, because we don't really know what's going on with that person anyways. We don't know if there are barriers to entry for them. Maybe they have trust issues themselves that they're not comfortable with sharing with you, or they don't know how to articulate themselves effectively enough. We can't really take those things seriously, and we have to take things at face value, because all we could do is articulate clearly our intent and how we want things to go. And that's really it. There's a lot of talk about avoidant and anxious people nowadays, at least on my feed, because that's actually what I dealt with personally. So maybe I resonate with that a little more than average. But it'll essentially show how avoidant people typically start ghosting, and this comes from a place of emotional underdevelopment, right? But if you're the anxious person in this scenario, and you've done the internal work, you'll realize that all we can ever do is provide the opportunity for people to work with us, right? We give them a chance. We don't try to jump through hoops to try and convince them that they should want us, or that we're enough for them. You shouldn't be going above and beyond to try and trick them into loving you, right? You shouldn't have to do that for anyone, because you want them to love you for you. You have to give them the chance to work with you. So when we give them that chance, and we can voice that we understand where they're coming from, or try and be a bit more reasonable and understanding and supportive, maybe they're having a hard time. And once you send that message, that's kind of that. The rest is on them. Like, we've done all we could, because that's the only thing within our control. Communicating is really all you can do. And so if we did our part, the rest is on them. And really realizing that is difficult when you think that you have to jump through a bunch of hoops in order to be loved. Because then everything in your mind, anyways, revolves around how you approach things, right? You have to put in the work so that they can respond the way that you want. But when relationships are a two-way street, for example, this doesn't actually pan out, and this is how we land ourselves in really unhealthy environments. Doing all these things stop being nearly as daunting. And I'm talking about the open communication and healthy living and all that. And it's not as daunting once we have a solid sense of self, and we start to realize that the situation is that all we can do is our best. So if people don't respond well, or they aren't willing to work with us, then it's kind of whatever. Like, sure, it sucks in the moment, but you're also avoiding a really negative situation, right? Because then you're just going to be this person's slave for the next X amount of years. And their seeming lack of care, because we don't really know the full picture for anyone, we don't really know what they're dealing with. If people don't respond in the way that you'd like, it doesn't actually mean that you are unlovable, right? Even though that's what our minds default to. And this approach is pretty fantastic for relationships of any sort, because then we can avoid the toxic ones. It's either we communicate healthily and cooperate with each other, or that's it. It's over. And so there are no games to be played when we have a strong sense of self and we're able to articulate all these things plainly and try to be more understanding to each other. And if we have a concern, we should be able to voice it and then work towards some kind of resolution or getting a better understanding of things and how to take it from there. Right? So the internal work is essential for a much healthier approach to life, because then we're changing the game both for ourselves and in relation to others. And doing this will help us to regulate our own emotional and mental well-being, because now we can see hardship and negative situations in a new light. Right? Like if I get the impression that they are, losing their faith in the relationship, or they are mad at me for whatever reason. Like all of these internal assumptions could be articulated, right? Whatever you're feeling, get it down on paper or type it out, do whatever, and think about how we could bring this concern to the other person, right? 90% of the time, these small acts of communication and trying to get that transparency is going to solve the problem, because then it's really revealed if they take us seriously or they don't, right? And so we just have to be on the same page in terms of how we're approaching that conflict. Another thing that happens is that the emotional and mental toll of anything negative happening in our lives is going to be minimized, especially if it's something that's been kind of thrust upon us by someone else or, by something external. Because then we realize that all we could do is our best. And we start to see that a lot of things are just out of our hands because we can't control other people or the external environment. We can't control how the economy goes, for example, at least not directly. Detaching from things becomes way easier. And when we later talk about how to get freedom from anxiety when internal work and philosophy kind of meet, that's when we become the goats. I want to talk about anxiety for a little bit. And so, if we remember, anxiety is when we start to impose our own control onto things outside of our control. And so, one of the examples I'm going to go through here is that if a friend is growing a bit colder, or you feel as if they're getting a little distant, all we can do is communicate, right? This is the only solution we have. And when this was happening to me, this is just how I handled it. And so, for some context, this person was a pretty wild introvert, and her social battery would deplete pretty quick. She told me about how she was struggling maintaining connections with people, and so this was something I was mindful of when approaching the situation. And one day, she sent one message essentially being like, hey, I'm just going through some personal stuff right now. But her last line read something like, I'll always admire how you could communicate things. And to me, I got the impression that this sounded like a goodbye, right? With the way it could be read, it sounded like, oh, I'll always remember the times we had, and that would be that. And so it was confusing to me at first because I didn't really sense any kind of tension in terms of how we approached each other or anything like that. I just noticed that it was a friend kind of dropping off. And so after a while of not sending memes and usual stuff like that, I brought it up. And so I wrote, hey, I don't want to sound like a skits, but ever since you expressed that you were in that rut again, I've been getting the impression that you've been a bit more distant and aren't talking as much as before. So I was just wondering if you're actually doing okay. There are a couple ways that I could interpret your last message, either that you're going away forever and this is it, or that this is just a little break for you to work on some things on your end. I just wanted to take a moment to ask for a chance to get a better understanding of what led to this point so that I can know how to support you better, or at least have closure and understand why you want to end the friendship. I hope this isn't the end because I value and enjoy our friendship, and I just want to let you know that I'm still here to talk if you ever want to. That was the only thing I could have done, and I covered all the bases. I gave them my impression, I asked them what's actually happening, and I was looking for clarification. And then she actually responded to that one and elaborated on some things, and things carried on from there. But even if that was the end, and there was an insufficient explanation, of course it would be a hurtful experience, because at the end of the day, you still lost your friend. But it's still better when we see it as outside of our control, because then we don't start to ruminate on whether or not things were your fault, right? Because maybe the default intrusive thought is that we weren't good enough, we pissed them off, we did something. A lot of the time when we encounter difficult situations that aren't navigated or approached healthily, the worst contributor to our mental and emotional well-being is us. And once we realize and really internalize that all we could ever do is our best, it really, really changes the game in terms of how we start to approach things, right? Then we could at least try to make things right, if applicable. And it enables us the chance to take controls of the situation again, right? At least from a better angle. And that's helpful because then, internally, we know that we did all we could and that the failure was out of our hands, right? Is it an unfortunate situation still if things went to shit with your friend, right? And they're not responsive. But it's nothing that'll make you second guess yourself, right? It won't make you second guess everything that you do. It won't make you take on more toxic behaviors to try and keep them around. The internal work enables us to rise above that. And we don't tolerate toxic environments. We can communicate our needs more effectively, and we can get a better grasp of what's actually happening when we take that step back. And so although things could still frustrate us, and bad things could certainly still happen, we're not going to be as beat up over it. And this gives us the chance to come back from things way, way quicker. Because that negative sentiment then isn't actually directed towards us, right? And that makes a world of difference in how we're able to process those emotions and make sense of suffering. And when we encounter traumatic experiences, we don't really take anything personally then. Because it's either very black and white, within our control, and we did whatever we could, or it's not. And that's where it ends. So the likelihood of having a decent life kind of skyrockets because now we're not trying to take responsibility for things that don't even involve us. And then we stop ruminating, and now when we start to focus more on the internals and what we could do, we take responsibility over the things that we should, and our life improves. Or at least our mentality first improves. Because then another benefit is that we're not inclined to abuse substances, for example, because the negative emotional state is just so insurmountable or overwhelming that we need some unhealthy mechanisms to cope. So even if you've conceptualized the 4 levels of happiness and how you should, not go all in on level 1 or 2, for example, the internal work really helps us to be resilient on that journey, right? And it really, really helps us on our path to get there. And I'm well aware that sometimes it is difficult when we're in pain to listen to someone completely fine. In this case, it would be me. It's very easy to say from my perspective, oh, well, we'll just don't fucking think like that. But there's this disconnect that you're not really sure that I can relate to you. And so let's go through a bit of what I struggled with together, just so that you have a better understanding of where I'm coming from and what I've overcome. So like I said before, I had a decent grasp on the direction side of things, like the philosophy and how we should live and what brings us happiness and all that. But I very much still hated everything because I was always in my own head at the time. And so, like I said, philosophy and the happiness stuff, it gives us the map, but it doesn't necessarily prepare us for any of the hardships that we encounter along the way. It doesn't help us with our communication skills. It doesn't tell us how to approach conflict healthily. It doesn't tell us how we could combat our own intrusive thoughts and get a better sense of ourselves. And so I still had a ton of limiting beliefs about myself, and this led to incredibly low self-esteem and a lot of missed opportunities because I didn't think that I would succeed, right? I had the perception, just the perception, that I wasn't good enough, right? So I made assumptions that things would end badly because I'm me, right? So there was no point in doing whatever ambitious thing there was because I was just going to fail anyways because I wasn't good enough, right? And these were all baseless emotional responses to things, right? And these were things that I never really vetted because I just held them in the back of my mind, holding them to be true when really they weren't. The girls I didn't talk to, or the people I wrote off because of generalizations, or the relationships that I didn't approach healthily, or the chances I never took for myself, or the conflicts I didn't bother to resolve, the people I didn't bother to maintain connections with. I was in my own head all the time, making unfair comparisons about myself, and I hated everything because I perceived things to be way, way worse than how they actually were. And these were essentially just misunderstandings. And the only way to get through all of that was by taking a step back and trying to see how things really were. And so now that I've gone through that process, my life is 1,000 times better because of it. And so one thing I want to get at is that these things really do take time, right? It's not going to be fixed, or you're not going to fix yourself on the day that you kind of unlock these realizations, right? It's not going to happen day one. And your life isn't going to change listening to a few of my talks, for example. Like, sure, they could absolutely help you, and they could help you get there. They can give you a guide, but that change has to come from you, right? You're the one who needs to internalize these things and actually address those issues for yourself. And if you want more personalized assistance, I had things available on my little Ko-fi, whatever, that you can avail yourself to if that's something you feel that you need. But you are the one who actually does the work. I can just give you the tools that you need. And one of the things that we really need to do in that journey is know the difference between acknowledging and internalizing. Because intrusive thoughts still try to come to us, like even me, to put you back into that toxic headspace that you were. And it takes time to incorporate all of these new healthy concepts into your life, right? So be patient with yourself. Internal work is profoundly impactful with people who didn't grow up in environments where understanding their feelings or working through situations healthily was even a thing. And myself included. I didn't have that luxury. And this is essentially living around people and being raised by people who are emotionally stunted or emotionally underdeveloped, right? There's no such thing in the household as emotional attunement. And maybe things like go to your room when you express sadness, or just being told, oh, it'll be fine, just ignore it, it's fine, don't worry so much. Or even, it is what it is, right? Maybe these things were said as solutions, and they just ran with that, and that's where it ended, right? Obviously, there's no fault to those people because they're only doing that because they don't know any better for themselves. And so it really can't be helped, and it is a shitty cycle. It is a shame. And if you can identify with that kind of experience, and it resonates with you because it's something you've actually gone through, hopefully I've demonstrated so far that better attitudes and approaches are learnable. And that is a really big key. Because then we start to realize that our development isn't limited by whatever garbage beliefs that we hold about ourselves. And this clarity that we get from internal work is that first step towards developing the areas of our lives that have been neglected, right? It takes time and reflection. So just be patient with yourself. Because you're confronting really deeply personal beliefs that you've held on to for years. And so I even said in episode 0, when I was going through them and articulating them, which is, how you kind of tackle it, you actually list out what you're feeling or what you think or what you're jealous of, for example. And then when you're able to drill down into getting clarity on where that could actually come from and if those things actually apply. When I did it for myself, I cried every time. Every time, without fail. Because every time I did it, I realized that I wasn't as bad as I thought I was. And that was so impactful and so moving. It was the only time in my life where I really understood that saying where it's like, oh, it's a weight off your shoulders. It actually does feel that way. It's the weirdest thing. I thought people were like schizzes or they were just, bullshitting. It's just an expression. No, it really feels like a weight was lifted. Wild. So when you do this kind of work for yourself, this kind of introspective work, certainly be alone when it happens, because it's not going to be pretty, per se. So now let's talk a little bit about emotional processing. And so internal work and emotional processing, they're very, very intimately connected, right? They go hand in hand because they give us that stability, because it's about getting our perspectives stable in light of our emotions, right? That are usually pushing us in a healthy direction. And we want to make sure that we can stay on the right path and not get sucked into those intrusive thoughts. And again, when people say work on yourself, they typically mean, getting a better job, improving your physique, whatever it is. These are the external things that don't actually help us in our lived experience, right? These things are largely neglected. Like, people neglect emotional processing. For example, the manosphere people, they call it pussy shit or beta behavior. And then they start to continue in these destructive cycles where no real understanding is being bridged between any kind of concept. And nothing is going to change in your life without that reflection. Because it's not going to matter if the same garbage keeps happening. You just happen to be a bit more shredded. Like, it doesn't actually change your lived experience. And one thing to note, and one way we could actually think about it, is if your ex did want you back, for example, just because you could lift heavier rocks, is that something you'd really want anyways? Right? Because you're still going to put up with the same toxic behaviors. You're still going to have the same subpar dynamics. You're not going to be comfortable in the relationship, assuming that your physique was the only thing worth changing. Right? You're not going to make any substantial change in the area who needs it. You're not going to grow as a person. You're still going to have your terrible beliefs, and when you go back to that, thinking that you fixed it because now you're a bit more shredded, and it fails again, it's going to make you spiral even worse than the first time. But the internal work and emotional processing stuff are the things that we shouldn't be neglecting, because these are the things that change our internal lived experience, right? Because who really cares if you look a little better? Like, sure, it helps, but it's not actually going to change who you are, right? Because nothing even matters if you're in your own head, making unfair comparisons about yourself all day, and you're really stifling any chances you have at connecting with others, right? Or if your lack of self-worth discourages you from doing anything, or if you feel worthless, or you beat up from things that happened and you never really bothered to reflect on it or process it, you didn't learn anything from those experiences. And so if you think having more money or getting a bit more shredded is going to change everything in your life, you'll only ever end up feeling worse. And you may even find yourselves taking on unhealthy coping mechanisms, right? And that's when we find ourselves in level 1 happiness, and we know how that spiral ends. We know that when bad things happen, there are times when we're caught up in emotion, though. and we have a hard time thinking objectively or critically, and this is completely understandable. And that's where internalizing healthier perspectives, and not just hearing them, comes into play. Because then we're able to call out poor mindsets and intrusive thoughts when they come to us. And I'm talking things like how we can't control others, or how we can't know the full scope of what other people are going through or what they're thinking at any given time. Realizing this can really temper our own assumptions about other people and ourselves, because then we learn to just chill out for a little bit. Right? Reflecting on if one of our limiting beliefs that we brought with us from childhood still applies to us is fundamentally life-changing, right? Because this is a lens through which we see the world, right? So how can we take a more forensic approach to the things that actually impact our worldviews? In episode 0, we talked about the manosphere content a little bit, and we had some questions, and some really good ones about how we can see if these things are actually worth holding to be true in any scenario. And so it goes like, does this actually reflect reality? Like, does my lived experience actually support these claims? And so we got to remember that they show us one particular side of women, for example. And so the example we gave in episode 0 was that they talked a lot with people like Miami strippers, or OnlyFans whores, or, whoever, Costco deli section woman that they found off the street in Florida. This really skews our perception of things because that's all they show. Or they give you statistics specifically from Tinder. Like, the people who use Tinder or deal with any kind of thing like that, they're already a particular kind of person, right? And if it's someone you don't even want, then that's not even relevant to you, right? Because is anyone with a good head on their shoulders committing themselves to Miami strippers? Probably not. Are we letting people like that influence our worldviews? And are we aware of the bias that comes with it? Certainly things that can really help us to wrap our heads around whether or not we can overcome that. Another cultural tenet that they kind of hold to be true is that you got to get shredded or get your money up if you want any kind of girl to love you. If we could think about if this actually is reflected by our lived experience again. So if we go to a mall or we go to a public place and we see couples, are they all going to be 10s? Of course not. Are they all going to be billionaires? Of course not. And we look into our own lives and we see people who aren't super rich or who aren't incredibly attractive, and they still have people who love them, or they still have a partner of any sort. Whether it's healthy or not is off the table, but is that actually a metric we should be using for determining if we could be loved? Of course not. And then lastly, trying to tack on to the Tinder stats and Miami strippers point, they kind of give the impression to their fan base anyways, that all women are whores, right? And we already went into this a little bit before and in episode 0. When we can apply these generalizations to ourselves, we start to see how things fall apart, right? Like, are all guys into feet or senior citizens, right? Of course not. But then we can also say the same about, all girls want money or shredded people, right? There are people into a variety of different things, right? Even among your own friend group, chances are, even with people you actually vibe with, you're going to have diversity in how you guys are approaching life, what you actually want in a partner, and what your actual preferences are, even aesthetically, right? Because people are different. It's a difficult thing to wrap your head around because we're so bombarded with the same, really, a narrative. And then once we see things for what they are, and we're able to get these counter views that are healthier and more reflective of reality, we start to catch these things a little better. And then we start to find that our minds start defaulting to these better perspectives. And that internalizing happens when we avail ourselves to new lines of thinking. Right? And after repeated exposure, that's why I said it takes time, then it actually starts to manifest in our lived experience. Right? That's when our new beliefs start to really kick in. Because then we start to think about things differently. Right? And over time, it comes more naturally. Sort of like doing anything. Like how we learned to walk. We had little bits of practice here and there. When we catch ourselves dealing with any kind of emotional, negative, intrusive thoughts that try to pull us back, one of the really, really easy ways that we can overcome that is by actually articulating it, by typing it, or writing it down, whatever you're comfortable with, and being able to refer to the healthy counterpoint. Because then it starts to really change the way we perceive and process things. So in the example where your partner cheats or leaves you, then of course it's fine to be sad or angry about that. No question. That's certainly a terrible thing, and you should be like hurt and angry and all that. But it's very much the difference between communication and conflict resolution versus explosions of emotion and spiraling where you think, if I were different in whatever way, they would have left me or they wouldn't have done it, right? This person was supposed to love me and they still abandoned me, so that means I wasn't enough. And this last one, actually, when that sentiment is felt in childhood, for example, like this person was supposed to love me and they still abandoned me, right? Typically, we could see that that's when the walls go up emotionally. And the rationale really becomes, I'm not going to let anyone in so that I become untouchable. And that abandonment in our early years, in particular, if it's caused by a parent, then it really, really sets the tone for how they view relationships in the future. And that could give us some context in terms of how we're dealing with people, or whatever the person that we're dealing with is actually going through, right? Or what the root cause of their detachment is. Because if they're not responsive, if they are just walled off, they're stonewalling you, whatever, chances are they still have their walls up from some terrible event. And this is actually one that I speak from experience for, because that was how I actually interpreted my own parents' divorce. And so if there's anything that I could actually be confident in saying I'm a specialist in, it would certainly be how we can emotionally process and perform the internal work needed for someone who feels unlovable. And all these intrusive thoughts come into our heads in the heat of the moment. And oftentimes they are baseless assumptions that we take way, way too seriously, and we let impact us because we take them with us throughout our lives, and we just kind of hold them to be true in the background, right? And that's what's really damaging, because these are things that always start to apply, and we never really get a chance to walk between the bars. We never will actually leave the cage. And so the internal work and emotional processing is what we need to get centered. And it is how we overcome our limiting beliefs, our insecurities, and we get emotionally stable and clear on what we want. Like, why do we do the things we do? And what value are we actually trying to extract from the things in our lives? Right? Like, why am I in a relationship with this person? Why am I going into the field that I am? Right? Or why do I even go through the same routine over and over again if it's something I'm not passionate about, for example? Once we get centered and we have a better grasp of who we are and what we want out of life and how we want to go about things, it sets the tone for how everything in our life changes, right? So then we stop tolerating disrespect, or we want to get out, or we do get out of unfavorable situations that aren't aligned with our goals or who we are, right? Then we're able to become more resilient because we have more stability in what we actually want to do in our lives and how we conduct ourselves and how we treat ourselves. And this also manifests itself in the form of more confidence. And then you start setting yourself up for success because now you have the clarity to actually do things that are right. And if you're learning all these things for the first time, the only thing that I really want to urge you on is patience. You should be patient with yourself because even I had them like one at a time, right? So I can imagine getting it all at once is a bit difficult to really conceptualize and take in, and really we need to have that time to let these things sink in, and even time to practice scrutinizing the internal beliefs that you have about yourself. I'm just packaging them nicely together for you. And don't beat yourself up if it feels like it's taking a long time, because we got to do or undo years of poor internal treatment of ourselves. And it's difficult because tackling these things, it's deeply personal. These are topics we aren't really going to find pleasant to address because of the way we've internalized it and the way that they impact us. So all we really got to do is apply this kind of scrutiny towards any belief that we have in our lives and to just sit with it and let it sink in. Because as we overcome these internal hurdles one by one, we eventually see how these things manifest in our lives when they become our new beliefs, right? And this is how our life changes. And although we'll never get to the point where we could become impervious to pain of any sort, and granted, if we ever do get to that point, chances are there's actually a problem. Internal work and emotional processing is how we get pretty damn close. Because now we know how to encounter or how to deal with anything we encounter. And so I'm going to encourage you all to do these things for yourself, obviously, and to also share this episode with someone who may need to hear it, right? You don't have to word it like, listen to this because you're a mess and you need to have all these things you need to address. But you can say it like, oh, I found this pretty insightful, and I just thought I'd share it in case it's helpful to you too. And then, best case scenario, if this is someone you're close with, you could actually work on these things together. And that would be really, really great. If you're comfortable to, let me know how that goes. Because I'd really like to hear if my stuff is helpful in any way, or if it's actually enabling people to overcome their own limiting beliefs. So get it out on paper. That's all. Have a good night.